Order. Welcome to this morning's meeting, and thanks very much for agreeing to speak to us. If you could just introduce yourself for voice transcription purposes, that would be helpful. We'll start with you, Tim.
I'm Tim Ward. I'm Chief Executive of the Quoted Companies Alliance. We champion the interests of small and mid-sized quoted companies in the UK.
I'm Debbie Crosby. I'm the Operations and IT Director of Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank.
I'm Liz Murrell. I'm Director of Corporate Governance and Reporting at the Investment Management Association, the trade body that represents the fund management industry in the UK. Our members have 4.2 trillion of assets under management globally and 34% of the UK market.
I'm Helena Morrissey, Chief Executive of Newton Investment Management and founder of the 30% Club, a business-led initiative to see more women on UK corporate boards. We're aiming for 30% by 2015.
Thanks very much. Some of the questions will be addressed to all of the panellists, but that doesn't mean to say that all of the panellists have to respond. We are time limited. Obviously, if somebody has said something and you either want to add or subtract from it, fine, but don't feel that you have to say something if everything that you would have said has been said by the previous speaker. Can I just start with, it is a general question. You may have followed our previous sessions. At one of them, a witness said, quote, "When you improve gender diversity on boards, financial performance declines." What's your experience? Helena, you're obviously keen to open on this.
Yeah. Well, I anticipated the question. That gentleman was alluding to one study, which was on the Norwegian experience, where quota legislation, as you, I'm sure, aware, was introduced so that within a very short order, I think companies given something like 6 months, listed companies had to put 40% women on their boards. And the analysis showed that introducing gender equality, as it were, that way had a negative impact in the immediate aftermath on shareholder returns. There are 6 widely recognised studies on experiences where, in countries where there is no quota, to McKinsey and Catalyst on the US, Fortune 500, SocGen on European countries, Citigroup on Australia, where they have a similar comply or explain model to our own, and to more recent one, Iris and Credit Suisse on the global experience, which all usefully corroborate the positive impact of having more women or a better balance on boards. And our empirical studies. And so I think it's the question of how you get there, not that women per se, obviously I think it's counterintuitive anyway, would detract from adding value, detract from value to shareholders. The other thing I'd point out is I think that the reason why the voluntary business-led approach in the UK has been having some success over the last 2 years is partly related to the views people have of the causes of the financial crisis and the fact that the traditional, often male-dominated boards were much too in sympathy with each other and didn't challenge management teams. And so I think that's a much more, it's not just its conventional wisdom, but much more widely accepted view.
Are any of the other panellists interested in either adding or subtracting to that viewpoint?
Yes, if I could please. I think from the perspective of institutional investors, we would support boards being diverse. That must be good for the business. They bring new skill sets to the board, they'll challenge groupthink, they'll embrace new ideas. And whereas I think there are a number of studies, it can be difficult to establish causality. And it may be that women are selected into the better run companies in the first place, where it's a voluntary approach. But you only have to look at things, say, for instance, Rightmove, which embraced new ideas in terms of the internet, and it grew from nothing to a 1.7 billion business. And you compare that to Trinity Mirror, that failed to embrace the internet and basically declined from a 1.6 billion business to 70 million.
Any further? My next question was to you, Liz, based on your evidence submitted by the IMA. I'm not sure that you really need to add that much more to it, given what you've just said, but is there anything else that you can say that would explain evidence that you've submitted that greater diversity has a positive effect on corporate performance? Do you wish to add anything to what you've just said?
No, I think I have
No,
just
fine,
said it.
right.
Thank you.
Caroline now, I'll bring it.
Thank you. I'd like to start with Caroline, please. Your written evidence suggests that legislation to increase women on board level isn't needed. But how can a high proportion of women in senior positions be achieved without legislation, particularly in your evidence you say there's a strong desire among the major firms to accelerate results in this area, particularly among those firms that don't have that innate desire to achieve these figures?
Well, I think just starting with the boards, I think we are seeing very clear evidence that without legislation, the voluntary approach is having a big impact. So just updating my own evidence, since 1st of March this year, it's 49% of non-exec directorships in the FTSE have gone to women. I believe, as to other members of the 30% Club, in the at least equal importance of appointment on merit. And therefore, I don't think you could actually better that rate of appointment, given that you're obviously looking in a smaller pool of senior women than men. I think on the study, the 30% Club has shifted its focus in this year to the pipeline, where there is clearly a lot more work to be done. In a sense that reflects a huge host, or a wide range of issues, some of which are very much sociological, others are very much things that companies, who I think, in fact we had an event on Friday where one of the ministers in the government spoke and referred to the current typical working establishment as having sort of 1950s air about it. And I think that it's true, just as Liz has talked about companies not embracing the internet in terms of their customer base, a lot of companies are very sort of stuck in the sort of very traditional at your desk, being very rigid. We've, at 30% Club, been working on initially an effort with professional services firms who have this problem in extremis, often more than 50% women at the intake, and then none on their boards. And it's been extremely edifying to have had a very detailed analysis and focus groups over a very short and very focused period of time, 10 weeks project, about 20 firms involved of their own volition. And we're finding to have a clearer diagnosis of the problem now. It's as much to do as well with the women's perception of what it takes as it is to do with the environment that the companies are creating. So I do think it's a multifaceted solution that's needed. We've now developed an executive pipeline initiative, much more recent, and interestingly there are a number of large companies that came together. They wanted to sort of skip that stage of analysis. They all said, yes, we've got the problem, we know about it. We want to move straight to piloting more radical ideas. And that's where I think the seed of the issue lies. In terms of where companies aren't embracing this, I do think there's been a paradigm shift in the last 2 years in UK business. I think this has moved from being seen as a women's issue to a business issue, and echoing again one of Liz's points that the better run companies are the ones who are thinking, how do we attract and retain the best talent, men and women, and what do we have to do to modernise our practices to be relevant to the future and to work more smartly and efficiently. So I think it's a bit of a tidal wave, and those companies and senior managers in them, CEOs that are sort of slow off the mark, are sort of being slightly sort of engulfed by it.
Okay, so I'd quite like to quiz you about the 30% being it's suggested as the magic number when financial performance of a company increases due to the critical mass of women at the board. Why is it 30%?
Well, in fact, 30% is the magic number was a line from the SocGen report that I noted, where they actually just sort of crunch numbers at what difference, what impact, what level of women did it make a difference to the bottom line. And I echo again Liz's point that you can't prove causality, but that was their line, not mine. 30% was the number that I chose because of the, unrelated to the particular women's issue, and the various studies that have been done on when is a minority group when is their opinion heard as their opinion, not as representative of the group. So if you have one token woman on a board and they speak up, people think, oh, that's the woman speaking. Whereas if you have 3 out of 10, so the research suggests, and obviously you can never entirely prove these things, but it does seem, again, intuitive that then that person's opinion is heard as an opinion. Some of the chairmen, Robert Swannell from Marks & Spencer's, for example, have challenged me as to why is not 50%. At the time when we launched, we had 12% women on the boards, and to be honest, once we're at 30, I suggest the rest will follow. But I won't be setting up a 50% club.
But would you think that as the percentage of women on a board level increases, that would then have a proportionate increase on the financial performance of a company, or is 30% the optimum?
Well, I do. In fact, there was another study. I don't want to sort of sound like I'm just regurgitating lots of other research, but there was a fascinating piece of work which Harvard Business Review team did and published in the Business Review that suggested it was talking about the balance of a team, and they looked at a very high octane, high IQ individual members, but all men or all women, and their performance around certain puzzles versus a lower IQ but mixed team. And it wasn't until you got to 2/3 women that you kind of peaked in terms of performance. But they were so sceptical of the results, they ran it again and got the same results, which was quite interesting. I do think that it goes back to all sorts of, I mean, the chairmen who are supporters of the 30% Club, and they're 55, this is their boardroom, and they're very eloquent about the fact they've seen a better dynamic, more effective challenge, more effective decision making, which should, in due course, lead to better financial returns.
Just before you ask the last question, can I bring in Robin? He's got a supplementary to that.
Just interested, talking about the chairman sort of taking a sense of ownership of this process, do you think there's more scope for institutional investors to take ownership of this process, and actually for some shareholder activism to be putting pressure on companies to put a greater proportion of women on boards?
I do, but let me defer to Liz, so I'm not always talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think in any market-led solution, it's vital that investors have a role to play as the owners of those companies. And we've had the Stewardship Code in the UK now since July 2010. At September 2010, we had 80 institutional investors that had signed up. Currently, at September 2012, we had 220. So more and more investors are becoming engaged with companies. And as an industry body, we monitor what that means in practice. We look at the activities that underpin the disclosures under the Stewardship Code. But specifically in relation to diversity on boards, and as an institutional investor representative, that's primarily what we're interested in. We have a number of sort of measures that are facilitating shareholders' engagement on this issue. We've had changes to the Corporate Governance Code in the UK. The code always required companies to report on the nominations process. Then in July 2010, it introduced a requirement to look at diversity, including gender, for the first time. And following the Davis report, it further modified the code and actually asked companies to report on their recruitment their board diversity policy, including gender, to set measurable objectives as to how they're going to achieve that policy, and to report on progress. And at the event that Helena was referring to on Friday last week, we had a report on what progress had been made on that. Because whereas the FRC had asked companies to look at this for financial years beginning on or after October 2012, it did actually push for early adoption of these requirements. And the Cranley looked at the annual reports of the FTSE 100, 93 of which had actually published reports in that time frame. And I think it was something like 59 of those 93 had a diversity policy including gender. And even though this is so new, 7 had actually reported on progress. So all these things help institutional investors engage on these matters. And as part of the 30% Club, Helena has an investor subgroup that actually set out guidelines for investors' engagement. That currently comprises 14 investors that have 1.9 trillion of assets under management. So they're all signed up to this and committed to it. And to put that in perspective, IMA has 220 members, and we have 4.2 trillion of assets under management. So just under half have committed to this.
Just before I bring you back in, Caroline, Liz, I was looking at the evidence submitted by the IMA. I mean, you're pretty forthright but the evidence, I think, is slightly more qualified, or at least sections that I've read. The start says there's a certain amount of evidence that greater diversity can have a positive effect on corporate performance. Not exactly an overwhelming endorsement of that policy. It goes on to list that, but then at the end it says latest research from the Bundesbank suggests that a greater proportion of women on bank boards resulted in, quote, a more risky conduct of business, end quote, before citing, quote, lack of executive level experience, end quote, as the cause. Could you comment on that? It does seem slightly at odds with your very forthright position.
Okay. I mean, I think the issue is that when you have academic research or consultant research, it is difficult to establish causality. And I think that's the point that I was seeking to make there. But I think from a perspective of institutional investors, they would value boards that are diverse, that are the best fit for the company. I've cited examples of how companies embracing new ideas did ensure that they had better performance. And what we don't want to see is a continuation of the boys' club of board appointments. There needs to be more challenge and more constructive thinking on boards.
Yeah, everything you said is fine, but you haven't actually answered the point about the Bundesbank. Would you question that evidence?
I think all that evidence I would question because of the difficulty of establishing causality.
I think the only thing to add is it obviously is important, and this is why I think it needs to be a voluntary business-led and possibly slightly slower than we'd ideally all like, because we'd like to wake up tomorrow and have these wonderful diverse companies, at all levels. But the fact is that it takes time to develop executive skills, and you can't create a CEO or a CFO overnight. I think that the one valid point that the Bundesbank research or that Norwegian study make is that, just by promoting somebody, just because they happen to fit one type of person or another, is bound to sort of backfire, which is, again, one of the reasons why I think it's very counterproductive, actually, in the end, to do anything through legislation.
Would you be able to look at that evidence and send us a more sort of detailed...
I would be happy to, yes. I remember reading it at the time it came out and thinking that it was the very, very weakly constructed argument, but I'm happy to do a formal analysis to...
Okay, can I bring Caroline back in? Sorry.
Yeah, I really want to talk about the pipeline that delivers women at senior executive levels from which the majority of board members are recruited, and really why it is that even in companies where there are more women, and this is a question for everybody, even in companies where there are more women at the intake level, there are still, that number dwindles significantly at the senior executive level, and how a company can increase the number of women getting to that stage and therefore the pool from which to choose board members.
Can I start with that?
Yeah.
I can talk both from my personal experience and more broadly about the policies that the Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank have. I think the reality is that a lot of women find the challenges of childcare very, very difficult to balance with their career. And there's no question that it's difficult to make sure that you have arrangements that are both flexible enough and cost effective enough for a number of women who are coming through the ranks. And, in my experience, there are certainly a lot of occasions where women make very considered choices and decide that they have to opt out because they don't have enough opportunities to give them that range of options. My personal experiences are that it's also very important to have a number of women who act as important role models who can give you guidance, not just in terms of confidence building, but just how to find practical solutions to solve some of those issues. And I think the more that you can create opportunities for women to learn from other women and look at those role models, the better that will become. But equally important is the organisation's appetite to support you. In Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank, we do a number of things that are targeted at making sure women who do return from work get very specific help. We run a programme called Baby Gurus where we get women to come and join workshops before they return to work. We also do a number of talent programmes and development interventions that are specifically aimed at trying to encourage women to build confidence and find practical solutions to some of those issues around childcare and just thinking through some of the real challenges that they will inevitably face when they come back to work.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add?
If it's okay to also take the floor again, I think that the analysis that we've done with these professional services firms, which, as I mentioned, had this problem in extremis, has been very illuminating. And as I mentioned in passing earlier, it does show that there's as much to do with the women's perceptions of what it takes, in this case, to be a partner. So, for example, at entry level, or actually from more junior level, there was actually a gulf in ambition, as stated. 76% of the men wanted to aspire to partnership, and I think it was 49% of the women. But then the follow-up question was, it was along the lines of, does work have to be your number one priority to be a partner? And almost all the women thought it was, and the men didn't. So there's something sort of quite... I think this, where you've got to, again, it goes back to this issue about culture, which we haven't really talked about so far. And what we're trying to do is sort of catalyse a shift in the culture, so people actually start thinking, actually, should I appoint people in my own image? A lot of this work that we looked at was on the appraisal system. And again, there is this sort of networky thing. I'm not talking about a formal network, but more of a sort of sense, very much unconscious, I think, that people are being assessed for a very strict, straight-laced sort of set of contribution, how many hours they actually are in there, the face time. And I'm putting down a challenge to this group in terms of these types of firm. Their whole business model is built on billable hours. And your worth as a person, as a contributor, is how many hours you work. Now, as a client, the question is, does that reward the worst, incompetence and inefficiency, rather than, it's not necessarily part of having great service from one of these firms. So I think that's a natural challenge. Now, there may be things I'm missing, and it might not be the appropriate thing, but I think that's the sort of thing that we need to be more radical, rather than saying, if we just had another diversity initiative, or if we had a bit more mentoring, it would all be fixed. Because I think there's a lot of fundamental things about how businesses work.
Could I just build on that? Because I think the tone from the top is really, really important. Our group chief executive in National Australia Group is a male who has children of a similar age to my daughter, and he's spoken on a number of occasions quite passionately about some of the issues that you've raised, and he has set some quite specific examples about what he thinks is acceptable in business, and really encourage people to challenge the norm. And it's going to take some time to change that culture, but unless you have leaders of businesses who are prepared to step out and not just talk the talk but actually do things a bit differently. For example, Cameron Klein's taken leave it in a different way from some of our previous chief executives, etc. And unless you've got leaders who are prepared to do things differently, then I think it's very difficult to make that culture change. I think people just talk about it, and the business practices don't really change at the pace that they need to make a difference.
Can I bring in Anne McKenzie now?
David, you've talked about how your own parent group set a target a couple of years back to increase the number of people in senior management levels who are women.
Yeah.
I just wondered, what was the level of women at those senior levels when they started this initiative?
Yeah, so when the group started the initiative, we were about 23% of women in senior roles. Our target is 33%, and at the group level we've now achieved 31%. So we're not quite there, but the progress that we've made in a reasonably short period of time, I think, has been quite impressive. Okay.
You talked about a number of measures that your company has put in place, such as helping women coming back after maternity leave.
Yeah.
The evidence we've taken previously has spoken about people who come back from having children, may be in reduced hours or part-time, but find it then that they end up in a sort of, in a cul-de-sac of sort of part-time work, and are then sort of passed over for consideration as senior management or promotion roles. Just wondered what ways you're trying to sort of tackle that issue.
So firstly, I'll talk about my own personal experiences. I was a senior executive and went off on maternity leave, and I got the opportunity 10 years ago to come back as a senior executive in the bank on 3 days a week. And 10 years ago, that was, I know it doesn't sound a big deal now, but I felt as if I won the lottery back then. And what I would argue is that I probably did more than most of the men in the 3 days than they did in the 5, but I certainly felt very privileged to be given that opportunity. I found no personal barriers to being promoted. I was actually promoted to take on the UK CIO position from working 3 days a week. Now, I chose then to come back to work full-time, but that was because the organisation allowed me to tie that appointment in with the start of my daughter going to school, so I was very fortunate again. So I personally have found that that's not the case, and I think that there's a two-way set of responsibilities there. I think individuals who work part-time have to realise that not every role is suitable, and I think you have to be much more honest about that, and I think that's a dialogue that's really important between the organisation and the individual. We have a lot of arrangements. We have nearly all of our requests for flexibility granted, but there are occasions where individuals ask for arrangements or they ask to go into part-time roles that we have to come back and say, look, we don't think that's right for you and we don't think it's the best fit for the organisation. Now, we do a lot to try and find alternatives that are suitable, but I think just allowing people to assume that everything has got to be flexible is just a naive attitude to business, and I think it's very important that the culture in the organisation is supportive, but it's very realistic, and it's realistic about helping people set achievable goals for themselves and the organisation at the same time.
Okay. And I mean, you've talked about the ability that you had to move from part-time work into a more senior full-time role.
Yeah.
Is that now becoming, you think, more a normal practice rather than something that was unusual when it happened to you?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, we have a very high percentage of flexible working practices, and that's not just for women. I think that's one thing that's important. I think to change the culture, if this is just seen as a women's issue, then I think it sends the wrong messages. We have a number of policies which, whether the responsibilities are for caring for older parents or other responsibilities where people can apply for part-time working, key working or flexible working, and we just embed and encourage that in part of how we do business now. And I think that's very important, that it's not just seen as just a women's issue or just an issue for junior people. It's embedded in how we do our business now, and it's very important that people like me who are holding very senior positions are supportive of that. 50% of my leadership team that run the operations and IT function bank are women, and 2 of them work flexibly.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Next session is on flexible working, and I've got Julie to lead on that as a former trade union organiser, and Brian Binley, I think, will be supplementing the questions as a former SME businessman.
What do you mean a former?
Right, okay.
I think the first question, Debbie, you've answered, but I'd be interested to know what other people think, and that is, can a senior member of an organisation really work part-time or flexibly?
Please, yeah. I mean, I think the answer is absolutely. I think it depends on the culture and the values that organisation holds. There's an interesting study that was done earlier in the year by the CIPD, which looked, I think it was a survey of 1,000 employers and 2,000 employees. And the general findings of that was that employees working for micro and small businesses are much more likely to be working flexibly than those that are working in the medium and large. And also that the smaller the organisation work for, the least likely employees are to have obstacles to working flexibly. And I think there's something there about size of organisation, and perhaps the fact that there's crossover of jobs and roles so that people can share, can cover much more easily than if you're in a much more ordered, risk-based environment where there are processes and procedures which make operational obstacles to working flexibly. But I think
that particular point up, because I don't think that's true. Having worked for an organisation like Courage, employing 6,000 or 7,000 people in their heyday, and having founded 2 SMEs, I can tell you that the resources available for flexibility are much greater in a bigger organisation than there are in a small organisation. Most people who work in SMEs work for companies 20 and under. And most of the information that those people carry about their jobs isn't written down on a job description, it's in their heads. And flexibility places, now let me finish, flexibility, let me assure you, places great demands on a company with very limited numbers in their workforce, and we need to face up to that. So you surprise me when you say what you say.
chief executive of an organisation which is 6 people, and we work flexibly. We have people who work from home.
It depends on the type of business you're in.
Absolutely.
Very related to that. Are you in IT?
No. We run an independent membership organisation.
Okay.
We use technology, we use cloud-based databases, we use all sorts of things in order to make sure that we are in contact and that people understand other people's jobs. So
but
that
you
when
haven't got a production stroke service type requirement which requires that the thing is open and ready to provide service in certain hours. That's the point that is vital.
Yeah.
And many of our SMEs fit into that situation.
Yeah. I mean, I too was mildly surprised by this survey, but I mean the survey was quite clear that 30% of people are now working part-time. 40% of women are now working part-time. Flexi-time is now something that happens as a matter of course in most organisations. I mean, it was 96% of employers offer flexible working. So I think times have moved on. When you think that the first text message was sent 20 years ago, communication and the ability to communicate, the ability to keep in touch across organisations, and I take your point, particularly service-based organisations, are able to work in a much more flexible and a much more open way.
But it depends what you mean by flexi working, because it covers a very wide area of possibilities. If you're talking about part-time work, where you're hot desking, somebody works the desk in the morning, somebody works the desk in the afternoon, that's a relatively easy form, and you may call that flexi working. I would call it part-time working, and my own company uses that to great effect, and we do it quite sizably. Flexi working suggests a more flexible arrangement than that. And it's that bit that really is the concern, placing the responsibility on the employer to do a certain amount of hours, when most companies at that level want them to be there at a certain amount of time, and that's the problem.
Can I just contribute something? Because I do think, Brian, that you're completely right, that it does depend on the nature of the work, but I do think that there is, at least in many companies now, a preparedness to consider approaches around this issue that they might not have done before. And the question really was, I think, around the seniority, whether it's possible to be senior. Newton 10 years ago, nothing to do with gender diversity whatsoever, but because frankly I was under pressure to make some redundancies, didn't want to do that. We were in a bad phase of our now much better phase now, all behind us, hasten to add. But rather than make redundancies, I asked for volunteers for just 6 months for a 4-day week. To my surprise, as many men as women came forward, and to this day, some of the most senior fund managers at Newton were staying on a 4-day week. Now that is because of the nature of the role, and I think we've kept them longer, it's helped remove the stigma. So I think that's where it comes down to, and again going back to these law firms, they can't work like that, but they could give women or men the summer holidays off, because it's more project-based work. So I do think that the idea of having being able to flex what flexible working means for the nature of a company is extremely important.
Thank you. That's gone way around. And I think you've almost answered the next question, which was the views of people ringing into Women's Hour was very much around, did you think the option of working flexibly or part-time can affect the running of SMEs? And I think you've really answered that, but does anybody just want to add anything into it before I move to the next bit? I feel you've answered it. Okay, we'll move on. So, Helena, this question's for you. Can you elaborate on the view expressed in your written evidence that states that young gifted people are expecting to contribute intellectually quite differently from the current senior organisation? And does this apply particularly to women?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for women, and I was really trying to get at here how the internet has changed everything. We've touched on it already. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, the companies are tending to lag this as an opportunity for creating a different working environment, which could be more ecologically sound, which can be better on all sorts of aspects of transport. It can be on office space and so forth. It doesn't work for every single type of company. But actually, this point was raised, first of all, by a managing partner of an accountancy firm who said to me, Helena, if we don't change what it takes to become, in this case, a partner, we won't be able to attract and retain the best and brightest young men or the best and brightest young women. And I asked him what he meant by that. He said, I realise now that the people who are really intelligent are going to, they in every other way of their life, up until leaving university, they have learned how to use technology in a way that connects them with people, that allows them to make an intellectual contribution. They do all their work online and so forth, in terms of their degree. And I think that, again, companies are lagging that. So I do think it has not been a coincidence in my mind, and it's come up in several of the responses to other questions, that those companies that get this diversity issue are also the ones typically embracing technology, thinking about how to work more smartly and more efficiently, and therefore attracting talented people.
Interesting. There's a question on employment law now. What are your views on employees being given shares in a company in exchange for relinquishing certain employment rights, such as the right to request flexible working and the proposed changes to employment law?
Perhaps I could offer an answer to that. I think there is a huge danger that if an employee gives up their employment rights in return for shares and they leave under adverse circumstances, you end up with both a bad leaver but also a bad shareholder. And the mechanics of organising such a structure, I think, is fraught with difficulty. There's already an existing structure, the enterprise management incentive schemes, which allow employees to share in the ownership of companies in a very positive way, rather than in a way which requires somebody to give something up in what I see as a fundamentally negative way. I think when people are hired, it should be done in a positive way, rather than saying, as you come in, you must give something up. I think there will be benefits from this proposal, perhaps for directors of companies and for founding shareholders, but I can't see that it will be a mainstream scheme which will be widely adopted.
One of the things that I think might have been the motivator behind it, because I agree with Tim's points, but is that from an employer's point of view, then if you employ a woman of childbearing age, or any woman actually, or somebody who's homosexual, or somebody who's disabled, so all the groups that we'd want to be included in or ethnic minority in diverse populations, then if they are dismissed, then not only is there the bill for unfair dismissal, but also unlimited liability for sexual or orientation or disability discrimination, so forth. I think that most employers would not admit that it might give them any pause in terms of hiring those people, but I worry that it's there somehow, that people are thinking, well, if something goes wrong, it's unlimited, whereas it's whatever it is, £62,000 ceiling on unfair dismissal. And I think there's something quite odd about that if you're a white male, heterosexual with no disability, then you could be let go for £62,000, whereas if you don't tick any of those boxes, then you could be asking for millions of pounds. And that is something that's a little bit...
Well, the reality is very few people get awarded those types of amounts of money on an employment claim.
No, but I think companies are afraid of sex discrimination suits, and obviously they should be if something's gone wrong. I'm not condoning any bad behaviours, of course, but I'm just saying that I'm anxious a little bit that some policies that are designed to protect people in any of those groups, and we're talking about women being 50% of the population, can end up backfiring by being such a big gap between what it might cost if things go wrong. So I suspect that might have been one of the motivators, that people are saying don't not hire that person because they're a woman, or they're this, because they could be a shareholder and perhaps relinquish some of those rights. But I do share the concern that Tim has, that to solve one problem we create another one.
Thank you very much.
Just before we move off this issue of flexible work, I represent West Bromwich West, a highly industrialised constituency with a lot of small businesses, many of them fairly traditional foundries. They have survived amazingly well over the last few years by showing great resourcefulness, huge commitment from the work. By and large, I think it's fair to say the management is male dominated. They live almost from one day to the next, and they put in very long hours. do you have any views about how small businesses surviving like this can adapt their working practices to effectively encourage the recruitment of women and part-time working? Because I see one model, if you like, that seems to work often in the service industries, but very much more difficult to adapt for sort of manufacturing-based SMEs. Have you got any views on that?
Well, I mean, I think we think that is a valid sort of problem to raise. I think one of the hopes that I have is that perhaps we've seen this in something like the 30% it's sort of slightly filtered down from the top, that while these problems might seem almost insurmountable when you're thinking, well, how would I go about changing all the things and how would it work? Instead, what we've seen is from the FTSE down to the 250 now, and obviously I realise it's a long way from these SMEs, but now companies are starting to think in a way that makes it less scary and more including manufacturing companies, but ones where there are bigger workforces. I think the worst thing would be to try and impose on those sorts of companies some sort of requirement, but the one would hope that as they see it, they might experiment with, okay, well, let's try this role part-time, or let's try job sharing in this particular role, or let's try somebody doing a piece of it from home, for example, a receptionist, or, that there can be an office phone that goes through to somebody. I think that if one tries to conquer it all in one fell swoop, it's almost mind-boggling.
Any other comments?
Maybe I'll just add, I mean, just from the perspective of institutional investors, whilst we've seen a lot of progress in the listed company sector of women on boards, the number of all-male boards has dropped now from 21 when Lord Davis first published his report down to 8. But if you look at those 8 companies in the FTSE, they are largely overseas mining companies, and it might be quite difficult for them to have women on their boards just because of the nature of those jurisdictions. And whilst there's a very strong case for having diversity within boards, we also need diversity between boards, and maybe they can't, it's going to take them much longer to actually achieve that diversity.
Okay. Can I bring in Anne again?
Yeah, Liz, you spoke earlier about the UK Corporate Governance Code and how this has been modified over the last couple of years, and the last modification was just in October. The Secretary of State for Biz, Vince Cable, just a couple of days ago was almost talking about a sort of name and shame policy for those company boards which in the FTSE 100 which still didn't have female directors. So I just wondered what you actually thought your views were on the amended code. There's this issue about requiring all companies to explain their policy on boardroom diversity. Are you thinking that companies are likely to comply, or do you think there's going to be a core that are going to be reluctant to accept this?
As I said, the this requirement is effective for financial years beginning on or after October 2012. But the FRC asked companies to ensure early compliance if they could, and I think the study by Cranfield was very, very encouraging in this regard. With what was it, 59 companies actually having a diversity policy which included gender. Mm-hmm. But I also think there are proposals from BIS that are coming forward now in terms of narrative reporting, which are asking companies to report on the number of women in the workplace as a whole and also in senior executive positions. So all these things will actually make the whole thing more transparent, and then it'll be for investors, and we've heard about the investor group that's coming together to challenge companies that do not comply with these expectations.
I mean, in the IMA's evidence, it spoke about the voluntary code of conduct, and it mentioned that 36 firms have signed up. This is about in terms of recruitment, and they're in fact responsible for the majority of FTSE 350 applications or positions. I'm just interested about how many firms have not signed up to the voluntary code, and what percentage the 36 firms are actually of the entire workforce.
My understanding is that they're around, they represent about 80%.
Right.
But if I could come back to you on that.
That would be very helpful, yeah. I think, just to get an indication, because I mean certainly 80% would be a very high percentage. The problem always in a voluntary approach is that you make instrumental and step changes for a period of years, and I take the argument, which all of you, I think the panel reflected, that this takes a period of time. But there will always be a minority of companies which will be very resistant to any change whatsoever. Do you consider that at some point down the line, perhaps 5 years from now or 10 years from now, if companies are still completely resistant to any degree of diversity, that the argument for actually making things enforceable by law becomes greater?
I think we'd be very, presumably it's quotas that you're referring to.
Yes. Yeah.
I think the good thing about quotas is that they work. The Norwegian experience has demonstrated that. But they also have a number of unintended consequences. By actually appointing women to fulfill quotas, it can actually be quite disruptive to existing board members. Not only the men, but also the women that have come up the hard way.
Yeah.
And it can also sort of demotivate people from applying for these positions, because women will just see that they can go in as non-exec directors and they don't need to pursue a career as an executive director, which actually is where the majority of non-execs are recruited from.
Yeah.
So, and in the Norwegian experience, we saw things like women became overboarded. You'd have certain women, they sat on 7 or 8 boards, and companies also sought to address it by doing things like increasing the size of the board.
Yeah.
That may reduce its effectiveness.
This is the argument about speed. I think you've made a fairly persuasive argument that if you try and do this too quickly, then you end up with these consequences. My point to you is that if you have a voluntary approach for a period of time, to allow people to adjust and to adapt, but you still have a resistant core who are not prepared to cooperate or to embrace it. What I'm asking you is, do you think then the argument to actually make it enforceable becomes stronger?
I think you need diversity within boards, but I think you need diversity between boards as well. So it may be appropriate for those companies not to have a gender diversity policy.
Could I comment on that? Because I think a couple of things. On Norwegian experience, just to clarify, it only works in terms of non-execs on board. There is no change in the executive pipeline, and there's no improvement in the number of CEOs, for example, who are female in Norway. It's only 3%. And 100 companies delisted from the stock exchange to overcome the legislation or circumnavigate the legislation. On the issue about at what point does it become required, I'm vehemently anti-quotas because I think they're discriminatory on themselves. I think it's a point of principle. But I do think that investors are the ones that need to insist, because ultimately they own these companies. And if it's a part of being to be listed, it's all very well for us to make excuses that they're Kazakhstan mining companies or something, and therefore they should be given sort of special dispensation. We don't need to be a miner to be a non-exec on a board, and if you're going to be listed in the UK, you have to abide by the rules here, I think. So I think it comes down to investors. If we really are serious about adhering to our stewardship responsibilities, then investors would be saying we're going to vote against the appointment of your chairman or your chairman of your nominations committees, or the appointment of directors, which come up for annual re-election.
Could I make a couple of points on smaller listed companies? Outside the FTSE 350, we've done a rough estimate of the number of female directorships of companies with market capitalisations below £1 billion, which is about roughly into halfway through the FTSE 250, and we reckon that it's between 7 and 10% of directorships. But I think it's very important to bear in mind that the number of listed companies is not a fixed number, and it's not a growing number. So that if the opportunities for women to become directors of listed companies is seen as being very important, it should be recognised that over the last 10 years, the number of UK listed companies has fallen from above 1,200 to below 600 in a 10-year period. So the number of opportunities is falling, both for men and women to be directors of listed companies, and I think that's a very important point. The point about influencing and changing behaviour, I think, is incredibly important from an institutional investment point of view. If you take Barclays Bank, it has thousands of shareholders, and apart from some Middle Eastern shareholders, I believe there aren't many that have more than 5% of that particular company. In the smaller listed companies, it's often the case that an institutional investor will have 10 or 15%. So the opportunity for institutional investors to influence within those companies' change of behaviour is significant.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Brian. You wanted to come in with a supplementary.
Yeah, you mentioned the Norwegian study, which has gained some prominence. Did they do any work on tokenism? And isn't there a danger of tokenism when a statutory situation is implied?
Definitely. I mean, I wouldn't want to be on a board because I was there as a quota.
Because you had to be.
I think in the Norwegian experience, the women who involved quickly became known as the, dare I say it, the golden skirts.
Okay,
have you got that down, James?
Yeah. Can I bring in Caroline on equality legislation?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about equality and legislation versus a voluntary approach, and really whether there's a business case for equal pay between men and women.
Well, I definitely think there is, but as far as I'm aware, there's equal pay legislation already, and it's been around for a very long time, and yet, obviously, every time that there's studies or analysis of what the current situation is, we don't seem to have equality, and which is why I think ultimately, and we've seen this through the financial crisis, that you can have 6,000 pages or 10,000 or whatever it was of the FSA handbook, but if companies don't follow the spirit as well as the letter of the law, then it's all for nothing. So I think that people can sort of tick boxes, but then unless they actually own an issue, they just sort of pay lip service.
I can talk about the experience I have from the bank. I mean, we have an audit completed annually, and the one thing that's important about that audit is we share the outcome of that audit with our union. So therefore, if there are issues that emerge, we are held to account. And what we do is we formally investigate any differences of 5% or more, and we've committed to taking action. So I mean, I entirely agree. It's one thing having legislation; it's entirely different walking the talk as an organisation. And unless organisations are motivated to do things like that, I'm not sure that you'll see a big shift.
Can I just supplement that with the Equality Act 2010 did give the government power to introduce through regulations a duty on private employers to undertake equal pay audits. The current government had decided not to introduce such regulations. Do you think that would help or not?
I think that if you have to resort just to legislation, it's disappointing. I mean, for me, the bank that I work for has done that entirely of its own accord, and it's part of the culture and part of the commitment that the bank has made to having a diverse workforce and treating people fairly. It's something that I think could be considered. I mean, it wouldn't make any difference to what we do in the bank. So from a personal point of view, it wouldn't change what we do. So, I find it difficult to comment on other organisations.
Does anybody else have an opinion on that?
I think a blanket approach such as that adds to the cost of business, and I think it should be much more targeted where possible, because if it's just yet another cost, yet another regulation, yet another procedure, then it's the smaller companies that have a disproportionate burden.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that, actually. It's just another opportunity for consultants to enter your business to advise you. Ron.
Perhaps not surprisingly, Julie wants to go in, so does Robert. But on that, can I just say, you said more targeted approaches. What sort of targeted approaches would you...
This isn't a subject I've thought through heavily or fully, so I think my general inclination is more targeting rather than blanket.
Okay, I'm not quite sure in the absence of a sort of coherent argument.
Well, I think targeted. Well, let me say that, where there is evidence that this is not happening, then effort should be targeted there rather than just saying the whole of industry should have to pick up a particular bill to make sure that a small minority or a minority are not behaving.
So, can I ask a general question about equal pay then? I'd be the last person to want to put in added bureaucracy just for the sake of it, because that does drag companies down, and there is no point to that. But would you agree that equal pay for work of equal value within companies helps businesses to succeed?
Definitely.
I see it's a moral principle, and does it help you attract the right talent and keep it? Yes.
Thank you.
Robin, you wish you had as well.
Well, it was actually to follow on really to the next question, which I think is slightly turning that picture on our head. One of the witnesses we heard from last week said even the current legislation was really too complicated, and that they would prefer to see a situation of voluntary self-regulation and a sort of, if you can do it, we expect you to do it, comply or explain culture. Do you think there's more scope for that?
Does anyone else want to?
In terms of all legislation, I think comply or explain is a very good approach. A principles-based approach is to be welcomed. I mean, I can't speak to the equality legislation, but I think generally we have found with smaller companies, we have a corporate governance code for companies which aren't listed, and that is a comply or explain approach. And it's principles-based. It enables companies to do what they can do to meet those requirements and explain where they're still working to match up to the FTSE 100 companies.
The issue has to be, what does explain mean if you don't comply? And I think that investors, again, going back to one of the sort of perhaps unutilised parts of the puzzle really here, or not quite fully fledged, is that investors often have typically accepted, or they just don't do it because they've got some sort of special reason, not perhaps over equal pay, but over other aspects of this best practice. And I think that that's one of the real obligations on the part of responsible investors, that they do sort of challenge companies, and if they don't get a satisfactory answer, I mean, the FSC again did what does an explanation mean, and found that many were very perfunctory. But if they don't get a satisfactory answer, then should either say vote against appointment of directors or not invest in the company.
We've seen a voluntary approach work in terms of increasing the number of women members on boards. Do you think it can have a similar impact on equal pay and narrowing the gender pay gap? And also, do you think activist investors pay as much attention to the pay gap as they do to the number of women on boards?
I don't think they do. I don't think that it's as visible. That's the trouble. And then this goes back to perhaps one of the issues over auditing and so forth, because I don't think it's a question. I mean, most investors, I think, would assume that companies adhere to the legislation and don't challenge them on it. And I think this, again, goes back to what one might be perhaps naively looking to in terms of the brave new world of companies of investors being responsible, challenging companies who in themselves are very keen to demonstrate their credentials in all of this. So I think we've got to create a bit of a step jump from where we are at the moment, with investors typically very focused on the most recent profit and loss statement and the immediate strategy of the firm to broader sustainable policies.
Thank you. I was just about to say that concludes our questions, but Julie, okay.
Just ask a question. You've talked a lot, Helen, about investors being the people with the power to change things by asking questions or not voting for people or whatever. In your experience and in the companies you've dealt with, are the majority of investors men or women?
It's actually an industry where there are a lot of senior women. It's the majority are still men, but I mean, when we look at our own organisation at Newton, we have about 26% of the senior investment professionals are women. So it's still, needs more work on it. We have the same problems as every other industry does, but it's a performance-based career, active investment, and therefore it's not judged. But your value is not judged by how many hours you work. I mean, I have a large family. I've been there, done that in terms of juggling things, but I knew ultimately it was the quality of my investments, and sometimes spending hours and hours on an issue meant that you analyse your way out of the decision. So it is something, just to be clear, that the group that Liz alluded to of an investor group as a subgroup of the 30% Club, 14 members, I think 4 have a male representative at our group. So it's not female investors, but that's just coincidence who's running the corporate governance area, and they do tend to be a little bit more dominated by women.
Brian.
Yeah, just back to SMEs and picking up on what Mr. Ward alluded to, most investors in SMEs are members of the board, or many of them are members of the board. If you look at the shareholding of board members, particularly for the under 100 employees, they're the same people. I wonder how that impacts upon this particular situation, bearing in mind a sizable percentage of the workforce work in that sector. It changes attitudes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's the point I'm making.
And it is about attitudes, culture, behaviour. We do a quarterly survey with the Accountants BDO. It's done by YouGov. Of 100 companies, we asked them whether they had hired in board or senior management positions, and 64 said that they had. 24% specifically asked for women on long lists, and from that, 38% of the shortlist had women on the shortlist, and 28% appointed women. Now, I think that shows a change. Now, I can't say how many of those are family-dominated or have a controlling shareholder within the company, but I think that it's more likely to be that case within the smaller quoted companies. So I think we're beginning to see a change, but we intend to track that over the next few years to see how that changes in terms of that question. But it's very important from our point of view that it's not just boards, it's senior management positions as well, because the boards of smaller quoted companies are smaller, and they will have controlling shareholders, but it's bringing people through, bringing women through, right through the organisation.
And how does this impact upon the concept of equal pay?
I think it must be a reflection of it. I mean, I think it goes hand in hand.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that does conclude our questions. Can I thank you. That's very helpful indeed. I think I did ask for any further comments you could make about the Bundesbank survey. But again, if there is anything you feel that you would like to add to the evidence that you've given us today, please feel free to submit that in a supplementary written form. It will be given due consideration, and of course similarly, if we feel there's a question that we should have asked you but didn't, we'd be grateful if you'd reply when we send it to you in written form. But thanks very much. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for agreeing to speak to us today. If you could just introduce yourself for voice transcription purposes, starting with you, Penina.
Good morning, I'm Penina Thompson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Mentoring Foundation, which is a not-for-profit which runs the FTSE 100 cross-company mentoring programme. Excuse me. I'm a founding member of the steering committee of the 30% Club. I'm a UK director of the New York Centre for Talent Innovation, and I'm the co-author of 4 books on women's leadership and getting women into the boardrooms, and I've brought you one of each, but only one of each.
That's something to do for Christmas.
I'm not sure that I have time to read it before asking my questions, but thank you.
Dr. Ashley Steele, Vice Chairman at KPMG. I've spent 7 years on our board at KPMG, both at European and UK level. I've also held a global role for about the last 10 years now.
Thank you very much. It's not such a problem when we just have two panellists, but don't feel that you both have to answer all the questions unless you've got actually something that you wish to add or subtract from the others' comments. But we'll start off on personal experience, and Robin Walker will open.
Thank you very much, Chairman. A question really for both of you. You're both highly successful businesswomen. Do you think that women face more obstacles than men in the professions that you've worked in?
Shall I start?
After you.
Thank you. Well, until about 1999, I would have said no, because we're all creatures of our experience and life history. And I had an extremely good career. First of all with the Foreign Office, then with NATO, and then 14 years, another 14 years. I do things in 14s. Another 14 years with PricewaterhouseCoopers. And it wasn't until I took what I thought was going to be the last step in my career to become an executive coach with a small partnership that I had my worldview challenged, because I started to realise that in fact my life experience in fact was not particularly common among women. I had, if I may, I just tell you, I had 9 clients when I started coaching. 6 were men and 3 were women. And the women clients that I had, although extremely competent, highly experienced, and I could see no reason why they shouldn't thrive in their professional careers, they were not thriving as well as their male counterparts. And that was the start of, I won't go on with the anecdote, but that was the start of an experience for me in which I started to see the world through a different lens. So up until 1999, my answer to your question would have been no, I didn't think there was anything. I thought, to be completely honest with you, Robin, if you'd started talking about all these topics of glass ceilings, etc., to me prior to 1999, I would have thought it was special pleading. But my experience when I started coaching and working with senior women to help them develop their careers, and realising that actually there was something going on here that was partly structural and procedural and partly behavioural, and I changed my worldview.
Do you think that was to do partly with the size of the organisations that you worked for, large public sector organisations and then large private sector organisations, and perhaps some of the people you were working for smaller organisations that may have found it more difficult to provide equal opportunities?
The answer to your question is I don't know, because the clients that tend to come to coaching are sponsored by their companies, and by definition it's easier for large companies to sponsor human development programs and leadership development programs than small organisations. So I think I had better confine my remarks to my experience base rather than take a punt on what situation might be with SMEs, in which I am much less experienced.
Fair enough. Dr. Steele.
Robin, just before you go on, could I just bring it up?
Because I think, again, it's easy to forget that SMEs provide 60% of the employment opportunity in the private sector. And so we can never afford to forget that. My view of SMEs, and it is my sector, and so I'm biased in terms of the viewpoint, is that they simply want the best person for the job. And they really haven't got time to mess about with all the other stuff that smacks them around the head and attempts to detract them from their prime objective of A, keeping their business viable, and then afterwards earning a bit of profit if that's possible on top of that. You've had some experience in that sector. Is that a fair view, or do you think I'm totally biased?
How could I possibly say yes to that question?
Of course you can say yes. I will say you're wrong, but you can say yes.
I completely agree. I mean, to your point, I completely agree with you that the situation in small, medium-sized enterprises is completely different. Interestingly, just in my own field, running the FTSE programme, we've recently, a year ago, enlarged that, and to welcome in FTSE 250 companies, which are not SMEs, but it's another layer of activity within the UK economy. And even at that level, it is perfectly evident that the issues are different. It's much closer. It's what's the best way of explaining this? It's a much more immediate relationship with the P&L for a FTSE 250, and I'm sure that's even more true in SMEs. So I am very, very willing to believe that, I believe that people are searching for people to do the best possible job and to appoint on merit. But your point is, are the issues different? I suspect they very much are.
Thank you.
Dr. Steele, if I can return to the original question, which was, do you think women face more obstacles than men in your chosen profession?
First of all, please call me Ashley. Undoubtedly, yes. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that at the senior levels of professional firms, there's still very few women. I was one of only 2 women on the board when I joined our board back in the early 2000s. I was fortunate enough that we then had a chairman in Sir Mike Rake who was very consciously not biased, so very open to diversity, but also very open to meritocracy. But it is difficult. I mean, I still find that men talk over women. I see that in myself, not in myself, and I'm not a shrinking violet, as my colleagues will tell you. But they have a natural tendency to speak over women. They have a natural tendency to go and take consultation to from their male colleagues, and therefore women, I think, get slightly sidelined. Therefore, women have to work harder in order to be heard. They have to be doubly. They have to be tenacious. They have to work hard. They have to find ways in order to get their point of view taken seriously. And that I have to say, I think that is a drain on the individual, and therefore doesn't necessarily enable the individual to be able to flourish and deliver what their full potential is within organisations. But I think anyone who feels that it's as easy for a woman to be at the senior and probably even the more junior levels of an organisation in professional services firms will be kidding themselves. I think it's much more difficult for women.
We heard some evidence earlier that the culture of billable hours might be part of the problem in terms of this. Would you agree with that?
Look, it's not something that I necessarily recognise. A partnership's quite difficult. KPMG has nearly 600 partners. There's a variety of different roles within that partnership. We're not all driven by billable hours. As you move further on up through the partnership, once you get onto the partnership, you just really join the bottom rung of a new ladder. And billable hours is very important in the more junior parts of that, in the lower parts of that ladder. But actually, it's all about relationships and building relationships much more as you move up that hierarchy. So billable hours, not so important. So I think there isn't one automatic answer, one size fits all in that regard.
Thank you. And just to return to Penina, obviously you've moved in and out of the private sector and the public sector. Do you see a difference in the approach to senior women between the two?
A very interesting question. I think in recent years the public sector has stormed ahead in terms of appointing, for example, senior women permanent secretaries, for example, although that now is again shifting. The macro point is it's constantly on the move, I think, this subject. It never stays still. But in general, I think one of the reasons I was very, very keen to, although the FTSE programme is called, the FTSE programme is called the FTSE 100 Cross-Company Mentoring Programme, paradoxically, it's open also to the FTSE 250 and to public sector organisations. So we've got the head of the Foreign Office as a mentor, the Treasury Solicitor as a mentor, and we've been delighted last week to learn that the Treasury, Nick McPherson, is coming in as a mentor on the programme. Now, why is that? It's because I think both sectors, I believe passionately that both sectors have a lot to learn from each other. That there shouldn't be these rigid divides between the sectors and silos. That's one of the things I've spent most of my life trying to work against, and to increase the communication and the learning across the boundaries. So yes, back to your question, yes, I do think the public sector has made tremendous strides. I think it has something to teach us in the private sector, and we have something to offer the public sector, which is why I've got both sectors in the programme.
Do you have anything to offer SMEs?
I am starting to feel very conscious that I need to develop something to offer SMEs, and that's not a flippant remark. We started this programme 9 years ago. It's 10 next year, and we're very proud of that. We started off trying to do something tangible, practical, pragmatic to address the issues that your committee is studying over this period. It's a learning exercise. We're all learning. It isn't a done and dusted thing. The first expansion step was to broaden from the FTSE 100 to include the public sector. The second expansion step was to welcome in last year FTSE 250 chairman. We're thrilled about that. We're just developing a pipeline programme, which I hope you'll be passionately interested in, because I certainly am. It may very well be that I need to bed that down this year, frankly, the pipeline programme, but it may very well be, as I listen and learn from the previous session, that we ought also to turn our attention to SMEs. Thank you.
Have you finished?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Can I bring Caroline down?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask Penina, what are the key objectives of the Mentoring Foundation, and how do you measure its success?
Well, the only purpose of the Mentoring Foundation is to run these two FTSE cross-company mentoring programmes, one for executive women and one now. As of last 20th of November at the Bank of England, the Chief Executive of Legal & General launched the pipeline programme, so now for the talent pipeline in companies. That's all it does. It's got quite a narrow remit. Would you be interested in a tiny bit of context, if I take a moment just to give you some context? Yeah. Okay, well, 4 of us set up the FTSE programme in 2002 after the Higgs report came out. We looked at that, read it, and were interested. I'd written a couple of books by then. I was consulted for the Higgs report, and then for the Tyson report, and then for the Commission for Judicial Appointments. So I was starting to be regarded as someone with a few interesting ideas on this topic. 4 of us bent our minds to, well, what can we do to try and help move things along, something practical. And the thing that we invented with the encouragement of 18 FTSE 100 chairmen was the FTSE programme. Over the years, the other 3 colleagues have developed their own pathways and set up businesses, or in one case become a professor. So I have ended up running it, which I've been very happy to do. And I was doing that in parallel with my day job, which is being a partner in the executive coaching firm. After Lord Davis's report came out, a group of the chairmen who were mentors approached me and said, you know, we're thinking hard about what our companies ought to be doing to address Lord Davis's challenge. And we've come to the conclusion that the FTSE programme is the strongest programme we've got in this country, a vehicle for bringing very talented women at a relatively quick pace through to being board ready. If we assist you in sort of exiting from Price amicably, if we help you set it up as a not-for-profit, company limited by guarantee, and we commit to support, you know, we give you some support. I've never been a chief exec before, I'm an advisor. Would you be willing to step forward and try and expand this in order to meet this UK requirement now? I was very honoured to accept. So for the last year, I've retired from Pricer and I'm now Chief Exec of the Mentoring Foundation. All it does is these 2 programmes. So it runs 2 mentoring programmes. It draws women to the attention of 58 FTSE chairmen, which is extraordinary, wonderful situation to be in. We conduct in-depth research. You know, we do sort of substantive research. And we hold learning events, for example, the colloquia at the Stock Exchange and the Bank of England, of which there have been 4 learning events. And we run, thanks to the kind sponsorship of Unilever, we're able to run a mentee network to keep contact between, because Michael Treschko, the chairman of Unilever, believes very strongly that the women can learn from each other as much as they can learn from being mentored by the chairman and chief execs. So those are the things that we do. I'm sorry, a long answer to your question, Caroline.
And just the last bit of my question was, how do you measure the success of it?
The outcomes, in the pack which I hope that you'll receive later, there's a brochure, and on page 3 of that brochure there's a little chart which will show you the outcomes against which, the criteria against which I've been evaluating performance, if you like. Fortuitously, even 10 years ago, I kind of had a feeling that this programme might work. So I started collecting data in a very, very systematic way, which is a great blessing. And 103 mentoring pairs have participated in the executive programme since 2003. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 criteria through which I evaluate their success. 22 have been appointed to ExCom, or the main board of their own FTSE 100 company. 23 have been appointed NEDs in private sector companies in the FTSE. 11 have been appointed NEDs of a not-for-profit or a charity, big charities in some cases. 4 have been appointed to ExCom, or the main board of a non-FTSE company. 4 more to go. 12 have been appointed to a significant role in public sector or government, including 1 permanent secretary. 21 have been promoted significantly in their own company. 3 have been appointed CEOs of a non-FTSE 100 company, so a smaller company, and 1 has been appointed a trustee of a pension fund. So those are my little categories through which I evaluate progress. In your pack, I haven't included the names because we guard the names quite carefully. But what I have included for your interest is a chart that shows all the achievements since 2003. So I hope you'll find that interesting.
Chairman, just to balance that.
Just a moment, Brian, because Julie did.
Julie wants to.
We'll bring you in afterwards.
Sorry. You've obviously given us a lot of evidence on the outcomes and what actually happens. How do people get onto this programme? How do they become one of your people that you're mentoring?
They have to be nominated by their organisation. Each, for example, after the Bank of England colloquium on the 20th, 4 new chairmen who'd come along on a fact-finding mission and were quite sceptical, to be honest with you. But they've since written and said, actually, I think we want to bring our company into this. What do we have to do? Well, what do they have to do? The chairman or the chief exec has to agree to be a mentor, and I can go into more detail later if you'd like. Equally, he or she has to bring in a nominated mentee. So if you like, or mentees, and Rolls-Royce have got 3 mentees in the programme. Other companies have fewer. HSBC has 2 mentees in the programme. So they have to. So a mentee can only come into the programme by being nominated by her company. So companies, if you like, are taking a view about their own talent pipeline and are positioning their mentee or mentees as part of that human development process to build their talent pipeline.
Thank you.
Brian is yours. Sorry.
Just to be balanced, you read a very impressive list out. How many have been sacked? How many fell by the wayside? What sort of tracking have you done on the other side of that coin?
Question before I try to answer. When you say sack, do you mean sacking the chairman?
No, I mean, how many of your people failed? I just want to get a balance. Have you done any tracking on that at all?
Well, yes. Oh, yes. I'm in contact with all 104 mentees. I mean, that's my job. Is to run this programme and to know what's going
Just
on.
So we can understand how successful you've been.
But may I ask you a question in turn? If
you tell me the answer to my question first.
Well, what do you mean? What do you mean by failure? What do you mean by failure?
Hang on, you've read a very impressive list of successes.
Achievement, yes.
And in order to get a balance, I just wonder how many fell by the wayside.
Right. Thank you for clarifying. Actually, none.
No, that's fine.
No, none. We've had one, but in order to be absolutely transparent with you, we have had one in the last 9 years. We've had one mentoring pair that I would describe as kind of so-so. There was no warmth between them. They went on for a year, and it was fine. It was very workmanlike, but there was no chemistry, and so for me,
well, that's still a very impressive programme, and that's.
Thank you.
That's
very much.
Can I just make a point though about mentoring, because I think one's got to be clear that mentoring isn't the fixes everything. I think what Penina's doing is a very, very focused by nature only for a few people, and we have mentoring for our people, men and women, not gender specific. Not everyone who goes through some form of mentoring necessarily gets promoted or moves upwards. it's only one part of a much, much bigger, rich mix of things that you have to do in order to help support women and men and people of different diversity through the organisation.
Thank you.
Robin,
No, I'm very glad you made that point actually, because I think that's absolutely right. And I, in my own business career, I was mentored by the first ever female partner of my firm, and so certainly it was something that helped me. But I was actually just wondering, seeing as we have two very successful businesswomen here, could you talk a little bit about what role mentoring played in your own careers and in getting you to where you are? Because we've heard a lot of evidence suggesting that mentoring is very important and can play a big role. I think it would be good to get some practical examples of perhaps where it might have made a difference to you.
From a personal perspective, I've never had a mentor. I've looked up at people, I've observed people. What now Lord Sharman did when I was assigned to him for a 1-year period, and I worked alongside him as his executive, not in a mentoring role, but in a real role. I looked, I observed, I learned, I replicated, if you like, and Sir Mike Rake was another very, very powerful role model that I looked at. Interestingly, 2 men, not women. And again, it was about looking, learning and replicating and trying to sort of emulate their success in some of the things that they did. But it wasn't a formal mentoring programme. And I think that I believe maybe a lot of people don't look enough at what people are doing to succeed, or they may not be willing to do what is necessary to succeed. I'm not saying that's right, by the way, but I just note as an observation. But personally, I often ask myself, because I also have a same-sex partner. And so some people tell me that I'm actually doubly disadvantaged. I don't think so. Actually, I think it means I'm doubly advantaged. But you've got to have a positive mind. You've got to be tenacious. I've always put the firm first, my career second, and my family and friends third. That's a personal choice that I have made, but that is a choice that I've made, and I'm very accepting that that is the case. It'll all come to me later in life, I think so. But I've worked hard. I work on sociable hours, and that's the nature of certainly in my profession what I have felt I need to do to get forward. Now, that's possibly not right. It's probably not right for a lot of women, and do the professional services firm, KPMG included, need to do more to enable women to come forward in order to be able to, and progress. Particularly, I have not had children. I do not think I would have been able to achieve what I have achieved if I had children. I admit that. I feel, my heart goes out for women with children. I cannot even begin to personally comprehend the difficulty that must cause them in order to be getting, moving on within the organisations. And do I think that organisations have to be more flexible, more helpful, more supportive to women with children? Yes, I do. And I think there's a lot more still to be done. It just wasn't my personal experience.
Thank you. Obviously you got involved in promoting mentoring. Is it something that came out of experience of your own?
Yes, but earlier on, I didn't use the word mentor. I didn't think of the interest that was being shown in me as being mentoring. What I was very conscious of, and have benefited from all my life, is whatever reason is, people have taken a kindly interest and have guided me, warned me, made remarks, touch on the tiller, a little bit of advice here and there. What is all that? Put me in touch with other people, been generous with their contacts, and what is that but mentoring? While Ashley was speaking, I was just I thought, okay, well, who will I talk about? I'd like to tell you that the captain of my Girls' Life Brigade was my first mentor when I think back to it, in her style and stance and in teaching me to march. Lady Lockwood was an absolute inspiration, and she and I sat on the governing body of a college for mature students together. I learned so much from her, huge amount from her. Nicholas Henderson, Sir Nicholas, I think I probably learnt everything I know about leadership from Nico, frankly. And then Peter Allen, the senior partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers. If I look back, I have benefited from so much. And it's actually that realisation was part of the 1999 Damascus Road experience, when I realised that not all women had actually had people of either gender take a kindly interest and help them on their career path. And that's something I thought I can do something about that. So yes, I have benefited hugely from mentors.
Thank you. Can a slightly different perspective now. Can I bring in Anne McKechnie?
Ashley, we've been talking earlier about the government's proposals on employee ownership, but of course you work in a profession where employee ownership and partnership is the norm, and where partners do not have employment rights. But I just wonder to what extent, given your own experiences, I think being the person in charge of partner profit distribution review at your own company, whether you're not thought that this particular government proposal has any degree of weight or substance, or is it going to apply to any particular sector of business?
I don't know enough about the detail of the proposal, so it's difficult for me to comment. But I would say I think one's got to be difficult to swap employment rights for equity in a business. Something inside me tells me that's a dangerous road to go down, and I can't quite articulate what that is.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, other witnesses obviously spoke today about the disadvantage of you having to terminate employment and someone still hold the shares in the company, what you then do in those particular circumstances.
Yeah, I mean,
which is very different from where you are as a partner, because if you leave, then you no longer have an interest in the company.
No, and as a partner in the firm, we have no employment rights whatsoever. Technically, I am self-employed within a larger partnership, and I could be asked to leave tomorrow. That is the nature of our business, but one knows that going in.
Yeah. Okay. And just perhaps from your own experience, I mean, a lot of the professions are based on self-employment models, but there are all sorts of, I mean, I'm a solicitor by background, and there used to be simply people were an assistant and then they became a partner, but now there's all sorts of gradations, associates, associate partners, non-equity partners, equity partners, and in your own company probably an even more complex level. So do you think the traditional partnership model, which has been used in many professions, is appropriate, or does it act as a barrier in a way in terms of perhaps gender balance?
I don't think it has any impact on gender at all, really. I think, partnership is just what it is in the word, actually. It means that you are shoulder to shoulder with your fellow colleagues of the same seniority, which makes you behave in certain ways that makes you want to be supportive. You're all in it together, and it drives a certain behaviour. And I think that's why partnerships are quite important. And when we can easily make decisions to make changes, and it's in a sense at some levels it's much easier. But I don't think there's anything gender specific in a partnership model or an employee model.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Around part-time and flexible working, Brian.
Yeah, I guess from what you said, Penina, that the question is primarily directed to Ashley, because it is about views on government's proposed reform of flexible parental leave, with parents being able to choose how they share the care of their children, particularly in that early formative period. And I want to come at it again from the perspective of SMEs, because I genuinely think the resources are available in bigger corporates, be they government or business corporate, to deal with this problem rather easily. The lower down the scale you go of employment, it's more difficult to deal with this problem, particularly when you recognise just how many people set up a life partnership from the workplace. And we haven't done enough work on that, but my guess would be it is considerable, and perhaps the number one place, maybe except for the pub, that people meet and then go on to set up their relationships. And I just wonder what you think about the particular proposal, and specifically of its impact upon the smaller SMEs?
Again, I don't know the detail. I'm not...
no, but your company deals with quite a lot of small SMPs as well as being big management people, so you'll be in that sort of environment.
Sorry, it does, but just for the record, I tend not to deal with SMEs.
You don't get in with the real stuff.
Although I have to say, I was brought up in family business, so I do understand SMEs. Look, you know, I think it's much more easy for a large organisation to be able to provide all the flexible working arrangements, be it for men, be it for women, than it is for a smaller organisation. My sister is self-employed. She owns her own hairdressing salon. All the people she employs are females. In that particular business, it's not straightforward when some of the women will have children and will want maternity leave, but it is manageable because they can work more part-time, they can take time off, they come back. But I'm sure there are other SMEs, perhaps in small manufacturing, where it would be quite difficult potentially to replace the skill, particularly say of a man who wants paternity leave. And again, I don't sit here knowing the answer to that, and it's a conundrum that I think, you know, we all need to continue to work towards trying to resolve. Because I'm very, very sure that we do need to do more for women in order for them to have the flexibility they need to get back into the workplace.
Penny, would you like to make a comment? I didn't want to put you on the spot if you felt that you hadn't got any background to offer.
Thank you. I don't, but I have an observation. What I've jotted down here is you know, my mind is starting to turn on the conundrum you've raised. You know, how do we cascade further out into the labour force, including people employed in small and medium-sized enterprises, some of the benefits which people in large companies have. And one of the things I've just jotted down for me to reflect on is I'm going to talk to Dick Oliver at BAE Systems, because he's extremely keen on getting more women into engineering. Sure. That's why, and needs to John Parker. Yeah. This is something that drives each of them. And I'm just starting to wonder whether there's something about perhaps in a year's time, when the women who have been through the pilot pipeline programme, in which BAE is a member, whether we could perhaps use them as ambassadors into SMEs. This is just a little idea I'm just starting to, through listening to what's happening this morning, I'm just starting to cogitate. I am going to give some thought to this. Don't have an answer, but I'm going to give some thought to this.
I think that's a step forward, and I'm grateful. Thank you. I think we'll keep the other two questions for perhaps the next panel, really, because there's no sense in trying to drag from you information that you're struggling to provide, and so I think I'd rather do that, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, if I could really just add, I'll bring you in a second. I mean, I have in my constituency many foundries, and it's difficult to get people to go into foundries to work. Fair enough, the age profile is such that I'm not sure this is a big issue, but potentially I could see it in a context where you have a company that is finding difficult to recruit people. You have flexible working and the opportunity for males to take paternity leave, if indeed it's a male-dominated company, as well. Just how do you address the problem that this potentially creates? Have you any ideas that you could throw at us on that?
Well, I'm a big fan of role models. That's one of the things that I think the programme has provided, and that's something I am trying to encourage the 104 women who've been through the programme to regard themselves as, because people who have themselves experienced something good that has added benefit, that has inspired them, that has opened doors for them, are the very best ambassadors for that process. And one of the things I think in my evidence, I think I popped down the bottom a paragraph about how important getting into schools, increasingly, I think this is more and more important, and into universities, and helping young people understand the full breadth of opportunities that are available to them. And I'm starting to wonder whether perhaps the mentees, of whom there are 104, might, some of them, be willing to approach this in a slightly more systematic way, the being of ambassadors, the being of role models. This is something we could perhaps explore. LMH, I've been on the strategy group of my old college, and we've been working quite hard to increase, to get a broader intake in common with many other colleges. And we've had some success. I'm just wondering if there's some learning that I could take from that enterprise and put it into the programme and encourage our mentees to be ambassadors and role models and articulate exponents of, for younger women at an earlier stage of their career, or indeed at school or university, considering, as it were, non-standard, non-conventional, non-stereotypical career paths, such as the one you describe. So I don't have a pat answer, but you would be amazed for me to pretend that I did. We wouldn't be sitting here if there were an easy answer to that. But I think role models can have a part to play. And being ambassadors, I think they might have a part to play.
If I could just explore it further, do you think that the implementation of this sort of legislation could actually potentially provide a solution insofar as small businesses that have had difficulty in recruiting people in the past may find it easier if those people feel that there is a regulatory regime that would meet their particular needs?
That's quite a tough question for me to answer, Chairman. On the whole, I am much more in favour of example and the kind of viral, the example, influence, best practice modelling rather than increased regulation. I think that's just a belief, part of my belief system. I respect the idea of legislation, but I'm not sure. I'm a big fan of carrots. What I've tried to do is with this programme is to create a carrot, something that people will want to join in, want to participate in. And rather than what I think I regard as the slight stick of more regulation or legislation, I think I'd prefer to see if we could build a climate of desire where more companies actually want to participate.
Can I make a comment on this? Because I created and chair a group of, we call it the Women in Transport and Logistics group. So it's effectively a dinner club. We meet 4 or 5 times a year. It's surprising how I thought there was going to be few women that we would pluck out to join this group. I was pleasantly surprised, and it continues to grow. And one of the things that we talked about at one of our recent dinners was the lack of, again, it's this role model, but it's a promotion of, female train drivers, female bus conductors, female whatever you want, within, lorry drivers, etc. And that we actually felt that what needed to happen was greater promotion. Women just don't see women as lorry drivers necessarily. Yeah. So unless there's much more of a public campaign around these types of roles and the possibility of women being in these roles, then I think it's always going to be difficult to find women moving into those types of things. So I would encourage, and I don't know whether that's responsibility of government or responsibility of local employers or the SMEs, but more promotion around this area I think would actually be a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. Caroline, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah, it was really not on this specific subject, but on this, the general information that's come out today. I mean, I come from a manufacturing background. My business is manufacturing, and so that is a business where it is very difficult to take time off. When my baby was 2 weeks old, I had to take him back into the office with me because it's just the nature of the business. And I just wondered, actually, within the mentoring scheme, whether you felt that in some way the mentors had learned from the mentees, whether they had changed their working practices to as a reflection of what they had learned from their experiences.
Very much so, almost without exception. The mentors tell me, and I go around and see them about 3 times a year, it varies, but certainly twice a year and usually 3 times a year. And over again I have heard, let's stick to the male, there are the male mentors, I've heard them tell me with some, sort of in some cases great surprise that I'm learning as much from this as she is, And that's a good thing. That's another cross-boundary learning thing, you know, I'm such a big fan of. So my answer to your question, Caroline, is yes, they do. In fact, there's a very nice, I won't name the company or the chairman, but one chairman of a FTSE 10 company told me that one of the things that his mentee had told him about practice in her own organisation had so startled him that he went back to his own organisation, summoned the HR director and said, let's call him Henry, his name wasn't Henry, but said, Henry, just talk me through how we do this here. Just tell me that we don't do what Company X do, because I don't like the sound of it one little bit. Now that was very interesting for me to learn, that just the viral nature of good practice, I think, is very powerful. So yes, they do learn from their mentees. It's a two-way process.
Thank you.
Can I just finish? As a matter of principle, and I think I probably know the answer to this, but I like it on the record, are you in favour of regulations to ensure that a greater number of women are appointed to boards, or do you think it just should be a matter of merit?
Can I pick that up? First of all, sorry. If you'd asked me that question a year ago, I would have been absolutely anti-quotas. I always felt that you could have it was either quotas or meritocracy, and that you couldn't have both. Asking me that question today, I have fundamentally changed my mind, because actually I think that we will not succeed in making sure that there is equity of access for women on boards or all the way down through management hierarchies. Unless we do have quotas. I noted the earlier comments around the 30%. The 30% should be 50%. Until we achieve full equality, then I think that, and you know, that may be decades and decades out, but I think the overall ambition should be 50% and much more representative of the population of the country. So I do believe that quotas should be introduced. When we get to 30%, I'll celebrate, but I don't think it stops there.
Oh, it just shows how wrong I was. Can I ask you, Penina?
I have to differ. I'm on record as saying that I think quotas would be entirely counterproductive and not in tune with our governance framework of comply or explain in this country. I think we are making much faster progress now since the publication of Lord Davis's report. I think, you know, people have got their foot on the accelerator now. There's much more to do, and I'm not saying it's done and dusted, but we are making very significant progress. I think it would be hugely destabilising for the kind of ecosystem of governance in relation to this topic in the UK to impose quotas. I think it would be a big mistake.
Can I just add to that? You see, why do I see lots and lots of women, not just in my own organisation, where we're really good. We've got 4 females on our board now, but across the businesses that I work and the clients around. And at the next sort of level down, there is a really rich vein of women who are more than capable of being on boards, both in non-exec roles, but also, most importantly, executive roles, and we must not duck that. I think, you know, the 30% Club have done a fantastic job, I think, on the non-execs, but we've got to start tackling that executive roles. And I think that now, you know, the timetable could be 10, 15 years out to achieve it. I'm not putting a timetable on it, but I think unless we put a stake in the ground, that rich vein of people, with all the multitude of programmes that we have, has already proven it helps, but it's still not moving us fast enough. And that's the reason why I think I've changed my viewpoint over the last 12 months.
Julie first and then Brian.
I think that's my question really, what had brought you this sudden change? And do you sort of going forward from that, you're saying it's because there's this rich group and we need to get them up. What in your experience has brought that rich group up? Because to get to that level you have to start at this level, and are we doing enough through that chain to get people to that level? Because, you know, in my experience, the the very kind of informal discrimination starts at the very lowest level. It's not once people have got to that kind of one off the top level. It's getting through that.
But by definition, we haven't done enough, because otherwise we would have 50-50 representation on our boards and through management hierarchies. So by definition, the answer is no. But you know, my fear at the moment is that women in the workplace and senior women in the workplace gets a lot of airtime at the moment. That is fantastic, but it still feels sludgy, it feels slow. And my fear is that rich vein of women that exist, and I see it, will actually give up. It's too hard work, and we will lose. And my fear is that we will go backwards and not forwards. And I think that we've got to grip it now, and start being much more proactive and bold in helping women, albeit through quotas, but also with meritocracy running right alongside it. I would never have wanted to have joined our board unless I had got there on meritocracy. That would be against everything, every bone and every breath in my body. But I think I do believe you can have both.
Right.
I don't believe you can have both, and I think you've made the point yourself that you can't have both in your answers to our questions today, because you did make the point that your life was a lifestyle choice, and the whole problem of lifestyle choice is emotionally and culturally more difficult. And if you reach the stage where you are having forced numbers, forced quotas, and too many people are not of the ability, as could be the case if you've got less of a marketplace, then you run into trouble. Now, that may not sound very fashionable, but it is the reality out there in the workplace, because it is about choice. And many people, women I know, do make that choice about family. And it does reduce the number of the size of the market available. And I think there is a real problem there between size of market and quota. Lifestyle, choice and quota. And I'm not sure that forcing that through at this, in fact I am sure that forcing that through at this stage could be very detrimental to your cause, actually. And I wouldn't want to see that, because I genuinely believe in the sector I work in that it's about the ability of the people, not about gender or colour or creed. I genuinely believe that at the level I work in, because I want people who are going to make my company more successful and earn me more money. Very simple basis.
So do I, Brian. But are we therefore saying that on average, women are less able than men?
No, we're not. No, I made that point.
I made a lifestyle choice. I worked hard in order to
and
achieve
that's
what I've achieved.
It is.
Just
let Ashley respond, and then if necessary, I'll bring.
But I don't think that the things that I have done is necessarily right for every woman to have to go through, and that's why I say that it's organisations have to do more in order to make the life that I had to go through in order to get on and move forward into the role I had should not be the path that every woman has to take, and therefore there has to be much more done by businesses, by governments, in order to make sure that actually what I had to go through is not necessary, but we still have women on the boards. We have, I think some women, I'm not saying all women, how could I talk for all women, but women, will choose to stay and be at home because actually it's just too difficult for them to go back to work. They'd probably like to, and we've got to change that. And I'm not saying that we have to get 30 or 50, choose whatever number you want in next year or even in 10
but you did say 50%. You'd rather go to 50%. You did say that.
I think 50% is the right goal. I honestly think 50% is the right goal because that is representative of the population of the country, or the population, I don't know what the population of the world is, but I suspect it's representative as well.
You're the witness, I'm not, but I think you run a great danger of setting your cause back.
Can I just comment on my point?
Yes, Robert.
Thank you. Actually, you mentioned earlier some of the issues that women face in terms of being talked around, talked over, those kinds of things. Aren't you concerned that there could be a risk if you have a quota system where women are being put onto positions because of a quota, that there's more danger of them being ignored or talked around by colleagues who will think that they're there purely because of the quota?
Yes, I think there is that risk. Absolutely. I mean, by definition, there is that risk. But is that a good... You know, I ask myself, and I'm still formulating my thinking, but I ask myself, is that a risk worth taking? You know, businesses take risks every single day of the week. You know, if everything was black and white, I mean, actually, business would be boring. I think it's a risk worth taking. I think we've got a large number of programmes now that are supportive. We've got mechanisms, safety nets, whatever you want to call them. The risk is there. But I think that the sooner and the quicker you get more women on the boards, the risk starts to diminish, because you've got a greater number of women on the boards, and those businesses will be successful.
On this, we've heard the Norwegian experience being quoted considerably during the course of this session. There is a study by the University of Michigan on this, the changing of boards, the impact of mandated female board representation. And I understand that it suggests that balanced boards through mandated quotas can have the opposite effect, undermining shareholder returns. Are you familiar with this research, and have you any comment on it, actually?
I'm not familiar with the research, no.
If you would like to be, and could provide us a comment, it would be very helpful subsequently. Also quote something else. Actually, earlier you quoted basically government should do more. On that, do you think the current employment legislation is too complicated? And are you in favour of regulation of private employers to undertake equal pay audits?
Like the previous panel, anything that adds to regulation of businesses, I think I would be against that. I think there's probably too much regulation at the moment. Again, I think of my sister and her hairdressing business, actually. There's an awful lot of regulation, and actually that's quite a cost for a small business. So I think I'm pretty much anti-regulation. The comment I'd make, though, on laws, I mean, we had, when was the Equal Pay Act? Back in the 70s, I think it was. I don't think we yet have equal pay. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that women don't have access to or equal access to senior roles where you find higher pay. I think the other thing is that there is a trait of women where we don't necessarily shout about our performance, the good things that we do in business, where I think men, and I know I'm making generalisations here, tend to be a bit more outspoken about their achievements. And I don't think we should seek to change how women behave. I mean, I think mentoring is, actually, I'm going to contradict myself slightly here, because I think mentoring can help women get out there and be heard. But I think actually I would want to encourage organisations to look inwards at themselves and look at the mechanisms that they have for collecting information about people's performance, and less rely on the who shouts loudest and speaks up, and introduce mechanisms that are about going and collecting in a much more rigorous way the performance of individuals.
And it's tremendously encouraging, just building upon Ashley's point. I think there are two very interesting developments that support that process, because first of all there's the government's own Think Act report framework that's been introduced by the Home Office, which a number of companies are taking up, which will voluntarily encourage organisations to provide that sort of data and that sort of information. And also the FRC, Baroness Hogg has recently, at the colloquium at the Bank of England again, talked about the introduction, I think the 1st of October this year, of the the regulatory framework that requires companies to report on the situation with regard to gender in their companies. So I think we've got those two very good mechanisms have been put in place. I think we need to give them a chance to work. I'm not quite sure how old Think Act report is, but it's not older than about a year, is it? And Baroness Hogg, the FRC's initiative has just been enacted for the 1st of October this year. I think we have to give those I would like to suggest that we should give those initiatives a chance to function for a bit before we start throwing the apple cart up again. That's a terrible metaphor, sorry. You know, throwing everything up in the air again, destroying the jigsaw. You get the point.
But the thing on research, you know, and it was interesting listening to the earlier panel, because the earlier panel, there was a lot of questions about, you know, well, we've got to have research, we've got to be able to justify that women are going to be better, you know, boards are going to be better, businesses are going to be better by having more women on boards, etc. I mean, you know, something here, as I sit here, that I just kind of want to flip that, would demonstrate to me that it's better to have men, a predominance of men on boards. But it's always about women having to justify their position and their place. And sometimes we just need to think about that and flip that question, perhaps. Maybe there is research on that, I don't know.
Can I bring in Anne? I think you were...
We actually,